There are moments in Hollywood when silence speaks louder than any headline, and then there are moments when someone finally breaks that silence. This is one of those moments. After months of speculation, rumors, and intense fan debate surrounding her departure from one of television's most talked-about shows, Barbie Ferreira is stepping back into the spotlight, not with controversy, not with confrontation, but with something far more unexpected: support. Support for a cast she no longer works with. Support for a show that helped define her career. And at the same time, a bold step into a completely new creative chapter, one that's already turning heads across the indie film scene. But here's the question that's gripping fans across the United States. Is this a genuine moment of closure, or a carefully measured response to months of behind-the-scenes tension? Because while Ferreira is publicly backing her former co-stars from Euphoria, she's also promoting a new project, Mile End Kicks, that could redefine how Hollywood sees her. So what really happened behind the scenes of one of HBO's biggest hits? Why did one of its most beloved stars walk away? And what does her latest statement reveal? Not just about her past, but about where her career is headed next. Stay with us, because this story isn't just about a TV show. It's about identity, reinvention, and the complicated reality of fame in modern America. Do you understand why this moment matters? You have to go back to where it all began, with a show that didn't just entertain audiences, but shook them. When Euphoria premiered on HBO in 2019, it quickly became a cultural phenomenon. Created by Sam Levinson and led by powerhouse performances from actors like Zendaya, the show tackled themes that many series only tiptoe around: addiction, identity, trauma, sexuality, and the digital age's influence on teenage life. It was raw. It was visually striking. And perhaps most importantly, it was polarizing. At the heart of this complex narrative was Kat Hernandez, played by Barbie Ferreira, a character who resonated deeply with audiences, particularly young women who rarely saw themselves reflected authentically on screen. Kat's storyline explored body image, self-worth, and empowerment in a way that felt both provocative and deeply personal. Ferreira herself became a symbol of representation in Hollywood, a model-turned-actress who broke traditional industry molds and challenged long-standing beauty standards. Her presence on Euphoria wasn't just about acting. It was about visibility. But as the show evolved, so did the conversations around it. By the time Season 2 aired in 2022, fans began noticing something unusual. Kat's storyline felt noticeably reduced. Screen time shrank. Narrative depth seemed to fade. And almost immediately, speculation began. Reports surfaced, some credible, others less so, suggesting creative disagreements between Ferreira and creator Sam Levinson. Online discussions exploded with claims of tension on set, including rumors that Ferreira had walked off production at one point. It's important to note, many of these claims were never officially confirmed. Ferreira herself later addressed some of the speculation, pushing back against exaggerated narratives. Still, the perception stuck. Then came the announcement that sent shockwaves through the fanbase. Barbie Ferreira would not be returning for Season 3 of Euphoria. Her exit marked more than just a casting change. It symbolized a shift in the show's dynamic and raised broader questions about creative control, representation, and the pressures of working on a global hit. Now, years later, Ferreira is speaking again, and this time, her tone is strikingly different from the tension fans once expected. In recent interviews tied to her new film Mile End Kicks, Barbie Ferreira made headlines not for revisiting old conflicts, but for expressing support. Support for the very cast she once worked alongside on Euphoria. According to her comments, Ferreira emphasized that she continues to root for her former co-stars, acknowledging the intense pressure and visibility that comes with being part of a show as influential as Euphoria. Rather than fueling past rumors, she chose to highlight the camaraderie and shared experience that defined her time on the series. This is a critical shift in tone. In an industry where exits are often followed by subtle jabs or carefully worded critiques, Ferreira's remarks stand out for their restraint. She didn't dismiss the challenges. She didn't deny the complexities. But she also didn't weaponize them. Instead, she pivoted. She redirected the conversation toward her present, specifically her role in Mile End Kicks, an independent film that represents a stark departure from the glossy, high-intensity world of Euphoria. In discussing the project, Ferreira spoke about creative freedom, about working in a different kind of storytelling environment, and about reconnecting with her artistic instincts outside the constraints of a major television production. That contrast is telling. On one hand, you have Euphoria, a massive HBO production with global scrutiny. On the other, Mile End Kicks, a smaller, more intimate project that allows for experimentation and nuance. And Ferreira seems to be embracing that shift. From an industry standpoint, Ferreira's comments and her career pivot offer a fascinating case study in modern Hollywood dynamics. First, there's the professional angle. Publicly supporting former colleagues is not just a personal gesture, it's a strategic one. In an industry built on relationships, maintaining goodwill can be just as important as landing the next role. Second, there's the narrative control aspect. For months, Ferreira's departure from Euphoria was defined largely by speculation. By stepping forward now on her own terms, she's reclaiming that narrative, shifting it from conflict to growth. Third, there's the creative trajectory. Actors who break out on major television shows often face a critical decision: stay within that ecosystem or branch out. Ferreira appears to be choosing the latter, aligning herself with independent cinema where roles may be smaller, but creative input can be greater. Then there's a third group, fans who are less focused on the drama and more interested in what comes next. For them, Mile End Kicks represents an exciting new chapter, an opportunity to see Ferreira in a completely different light. What's undeniable is the level of engagement. This isn't just a celebrity interview, it's a cultural conversation, one that touches on authenticity, perception, and the evolving relationship between public figures and their audiences. Looking ahead, Ferreira's trajectory could signal a broader shift, not just for her, but for actors navigating similar transitions. Her move toward independent film suggests a desire for creative control, for roles that challenge rather than define her. If Mile End Kicks resonates with audiences and critics, it could open the door to a new phase of her career, one less tied to mainstream television and more aligned with auteur-driven projects. Meanwhile, Euphoria itself faces its own uncertain future. With cast changes, production delays, and evolving storylines, the show is entering a new era, one that will inevitably be compared to what came before. Ferreira's absence will be felt, particularly among fans who connected with Kat's journey. But her supportive stance may help ease that transition, reinforcing the idea that departures don't have to mean division. At its core, this story isn't just about Hollywood. It's about something much more universal. It's about leaving something behind. About outgrowing a role, a chapter, a version of yourself, and figuring out what comes next. For many viewers, Ferreira's journey mirrors their own experiences. The idea of walking away from something familiar, something successful even, in pursuit of something more authentic, it's both inspiring and deeply relatable. And then there's the human connection. Despite the headlines, despite the speculation, Ferreira's recent comments remind us that behind every production, every show, every viral moment, there are real people navigating complex relationships and emotions. Her decision to express support, rather than dwell on conflict, adds a layer of humanity to a story that could have easily remained defined by drama. As this story continues to unfold, one thing is clear: audiences are paying attention, not just to what happens on screen, but to what happens off it. So now we want to hear from you. Do you believe Barbie Ferreira's comments signal genuine closure with the Euphoria cast? Or do you think there's more beneath the surface that hasn't been revealed yet? And perhaps most importantly, are you excited to see her in Mile End Kicks? Or do you think her departure from Euphoria leaves a gap that can't be filled? Join the conversation. Share your perspective in the comments. And if you're following stories like this, where entertainment, culture, and real human experiences collide, make sure you stay connected. Because the next chapter in this story may be just beginning. There's a pattern in Hollywood that rarely gets discussed openly, but everyone in the industry understands it. When a breakout star rises through a culturally defining show like Euphoria, their identity can quickly become inseparable from that role. And for Barbie Ferreira, that role was Kat Hernandez. But here's where things get complicated. Kat wasn't just another character. She represented something deeper, especially in the American media landscape, where body diversity and authentic storytelling have long been debated but rarely executed with mainstream visibility. Ferreira's portrayal connected with millions of viewers who saw themselves reflected in her confidence, her vulnerability, and her evolution. So when her screen time appeared to shrink in season 2, fans didn't just notice, it felt personal. And that's where the narrative began to fracture. Behind the scenes, the creative direction of Euphoria, led by Sam Levinson, has often been described as highly centralized. Levinson is known for writing much of the series himself, shaping characters through his singular vision. That approach has led to critical acclaim, but it's also sparked quiet conversations about how much flexibility actors truly have within that system. Now, to be clear, there has been no confirmed public record of direct conflict that definitively explains Ferreira's departure. But in Hollywood, absence of confirmation doesn't always mean absence of tension. It often means something more nuanced, something negotiated behind closed doors. And that's exactly what makes Ferreira's recent comments so significant. Because instead of reopening old wounds, she's choosing to close them, or at least present them as closed. When Ferreira talks about mile-end kicks, there's a noticeable shift in tone. The language changes. The energy changes. The focus becomes less about spectacle and more about process. And that distinction matters. Independent films operate in a completely different ecosystem than HBO productions. Budgets are smaller. Timelines are tighter. But creative intimacy? That's where indie projects often thrive. For an actor like Ferreira, this shift could represent more than just a new job. It could signal a recalibration of her entire career. In mainstream television, especially in a show as stylized and visually driven as Euphoria, actors often function within a larger machine. Every frame is meticulously constructed. Every storyline is part of a broader narrative architecture. In contrast, independent films like Mile-End Kicks tend to offer something different. Space. Space to experiment. Space to fail. Space to redefine. And according to Ferreira's own reflections, that space appears to be exactly what she was looking for. But let's ask the bigger question. Is this move a risk or a long-term investment? Because history shows us that actors who successfully transition from mainstream hits to indie credibility often emerge with something far more valuable than fame. They gain artistic legitimacy. And in an industry where longevity is everything, that distinction can be career-defining. Timing in media is never accidental. Ferreira didn't make these supportive comments immediately after leaving Euphoria. And her decision to express support for her former castmates adds a layer of professionalism that resonates strongly within the American entertainment industry. It signals that, regardless of what may have happened behind the scenes, she's choosing not to define her career by conflict. That choice carries weight. Because in a culture increasingly driven by controversy and viral drama, restraint can be its own form of influence. Within Hollywood circles, Ferreira's move is being watched closely. Not just because of her association with Euphoria, but because her situation reflects a broader trend: young actors navigating high-profile success while trying to maintain control over their personal and professional identities. Industry insiders often point to a key challenge. When a show becomes as dominant as Euphoria, it can overshadow the individual trajectories of its cast members. Breaking free from that shadow requires careful strategy. And Ferreira's approach, supportive public messaging combined with a pivot to independent film, fits a pattern that has worked for other actors in the past. It's a balancing act. Stay respectful enough to preserve relationships. Move boldly enough to establish independence. And most importantly, avoid being boxed into a single narrative. From a professional standpoint, Ferreira appears to be executing that balance with precision. Let's zoom out for a moment, because this story taps into something much bigger than one actress or one show. American audiences have developed a deep fascination with what happens behind the camera. It's no longer enough to watch a show. We want to understand the dynamics, the tensions, the real-life relationships that shape what we see on screen. Euphoria, in particular, has become a lightning rod for this kind of attention. Its intense themes, its visually provocative style, and its ensemble cast of rising stars have made it a cultural centerpiece, and with that comes scrutiny. So when someone like Barbie Ferreira exits that world, the public doesn't just accept it, they investigate it. They analyze interviews. They revisit old scenes. They look for clues. And in doing so, they create narratives that may or may not reflect reality. Ferreira's recent comments don't just address her own situation, they challenge that entire cycle. By choosing clarity over ambiguity, support over speculation, she's attempting to reset the conversation. But whether the audience accepts that reset is another question entirely. Across the United States, fan reactions continue to evolve, and they're anything but uniform. There's a segment of viewers who feel a sense of closure after hearing Ferreira's supportive stance. For them, this is the resolution they were hoping for, a sign that whatever happened behind the scenes didn't fracture the relationships they cared about. But there's also a more skeptical audience. These viewers point to the timing, to the promotional context, and to the lack of detailed explanation. They argue that while Ferreira's comments are respectful, they don't fully address the questions that have been circulating for years. And then there's a third group, arguably the most forward-looking. They're less concerned with what happened and more interested in what's next. For them, Mile End Kicks isn't just a film, it's a test. A chance to see whether Ferreira can successfully redefine herself outside the Euphoria universe. This division isn't unusual. In fact, it reflects a broader shift in how audiences engage with celebrity narratives. People aren't just passive viewers anymore, they're active participants in the storytelling process. And that means every statement, every project, every move gets analyzed from multiple angles. At its core, this isn't just a Hollywood story, it's a human one. Because leaving something behind, especially something successful, is never easy. It requires confidence. It requires clarity. And perhaps most importantly, it requires a willingness to embrace uncertainty. For Ferreira, walking away from Euphoria meant stepping away from a platform that brought her global recognition. That kind of decision doesn't happen lightly. And for viewers, it raises a question that feels deeply personal. What would you do in that situation? Would you stay, even if it meant compromising creatively? Or would you leave, risking visibility for the chance to grow? These are the kinds of questions that transcend entertainment. They touch on identity, ambition, and the universal desire to be seen, not just as we are, but as we want to become. As Ferreira continues promoting Mile End Kicks, the focus will inevitably shift from her past to her future. And that's where the real story begins. Because reinvention in Hollywood isn't just about taking on new roles, it's about reshaping how audiences perceive you. It's about proving that you're more than the character that made you famous. For Ferreira, that process is already underway. Her words, her choices, her projects, they're all part of a larger narrative arc. One that moves from breakout success, through controversy, and into transformation. The question now is simple, but the answer will take time. Will audiences follow her into this next chapter? And just as that question begins to settle, another layer of this story starts to emerge. One that goes beyond career moves and public statements. Because behind every Hollywood transition, there are personal moments that rarely make headlines. Moments of doubt. Moments of reflection. Moments that ultimately shape the decisions we see play out in public. In the next part of this deep dive, we're going to explore those unseen dimensions, the emotional reality of leaving a cultural phenomenon, the pressure of redefining success, and the quiet choices that determine whether a career simply continues or truly evolves.